We're at the climax of Genesis, the Genesis story about Joseph. It's Genesis chapters 44 and 45. We're covering 2 chapters today. It is currently 11:03 a.m. We're covering 2 chapters of Scripture, so lunch will be served at 1:30. No, we're gonna get through it on a slightly abbreviated form. It is the climax of the story. The story so far for Joseph was he was the favored son of 12 brothers. He was hated by 10 of his elder brothers. His 10 older brothers hated him greatly. They sold him into slavery, faked his death to their father, and for the next 20 to 30 years he lived in Egypt, initially as a slave, then as a prisoner, and for the last several years as Pharaoh's right-hand man. Joseph's story has been one of elevation and destruction and elevation and destruction. He keeps going up and down and up and down. His life has been a series of missteps done against him, even though if you read the story, he's innocent the whole way through. An innocent man going through terrible times. Joseph's brothers have come to him now twice asking for food because that was Joseph's job. They did not know that they were talking to Joseph. They thought they were talking to an Egyptian official, which Joseph was, but they didn't recognize their brother after all of those years, yet he recognized them. They have brought back Benjamin, Joseph's younger brother, with them this second time, and we pick up after the feast that Joseph fed his brothers in Genesis 43. It says this, starting in chapter 44, verse 1. Then he commanded the steward of his house, fill the men's sacks with food, as much as they can carry, and put each man's money in the mouth of his sack, and put my cup, the silver cup, in the mouth of the sack of the youngest, and with his money for the grain. And he did as Joseph told him. And as soon as the morning was light, the men were sent away with their donkeys. They had gone only a short distance from the city. And now Joseph said to his steward, "Up, follow after the men, and you will overtake them, and say to them, 'Why have you repaid evil for good? Is it not from this that my Lord drinks, and by this that he practices divination? You have done evil in doing this.'" Now, Joseph is beginning the process of trying to make sure, or he's finishing the process of making sure, that his brothers had an actual change of heart. The first change of heart that he tested them on was to see whether or not they would return for one of their own. If they would come back for Simeon, with the condition of bringing Benjamin, he wanted to see, will you do that thing? They did. They came back with Benjamin after a period of months, and came back with Benjamin, and they got Simeon. And so far, the brothers are passing Joseph's test. But Joseph wants to see if these brothers truly are dedicated to their family. And so he takes the grain that he's giving the brothers, he gives them their money back, and he puts in Benjamin's sack the cup that is a special chalice that was clearly identified as Joseph's. And Joseph has that cup placed in Benjamin's sack with the purpose of going and catching them and accusing Benjamin of stealing said cup. Now, this isn't the most honest plan, right? Obviously, there's some deception going on and things of that nature. But what he's trying to see is if Benjamin is going to be taken back to the Huskau, right? And the other 11 or 10 brothers are allowed to go free. Will they love Benjamin enough to fight for him? Will they do what they need to do for him? Benjamin, like Joseph, was the child of the favored wife. They were the only 2 children of the favored wife. And obviously the 10 brothers got along, but was Benjamin loved by his brothers or not? So the steward does that. He runs up, overtakes them, says, "Hey, you stole his cup." So verse 19 says, "Whichever of your servants is found with it shall die." This is them speaking, the brothers. "Whichever of your servants is found with it shall die, and we also will be my Lord's servant." And he said, "Let it be as you say. He who is found with it will be my servant. The rest of you will be innocent." Then each man lowered his sack quickly to the ground, and each man opened his sack, starting with the eldest and ending with the youngest. And the cup was found in Benjamin's sack, and they tore their clothes, and every man loaded his donkey, and they returned to the city. So the steward says, look, the brothers say, look, if we stole it, which we didn't, then you can kill that guy, and the rest of us will work for you the rest of our lives. We'll be servants for you. And he says, no, that's not what's going to happen. What's going to happen is if one of you has this cup, which I know you do, that guy will be our servant, and the rest of you can go free because y'all aren't guilty of that crime. The cup is ultimately found in Benjamin's sack, and the big news is they all return. Right? They could have gone on. They could have left Benjamin in Egypt. They had a free pass to go, just as they had a free pass many moons ago when Joseph was sold off to the Midian traders to go down to Egypt, had a free pass to go. It was basically the exact same situation. Will you abandon this brother? And they tear their clothes, a sign of mourning, and they return back to the city. Judah steps up and begins to take the leadership role, which is going to be his from now on. And goes and is after Joseph accuses them of stealing this cup that he uses. Judah says in verse 16, he says, "What shall we say to my Lord? What shall we speak? Or how can we clear ourselves? God has found out the guilt of your servants. Behold, we are my Lord's servants, both we and he also in whose hand the cup has been found." But Joseph said, "Far be it from me that I should do so. Only the man in whose hand the cup was found shall be my servant. But as for you, go up in peace to your father." And Judah went up to Joseph, and he said to him, "O my Lord, please let your servant speak a word in your ears, and let not your anger burn against your servant, for you are like Pharaoh himself. My Lord asked his servant, saying, 'Have you a father or a brother?' And we said, 'We have a father.'" And he goes through and describes this whole thing. He says, "Look, this youngest child," verse 23, "is his favorite." And verse 23 says, "Then you said to your servants, 'Unless your youngest brother comes down, we will not see my face again.' And we went and we told our father all of these things. And eventually he said, 'Go and buy us a little food.' In verse 26, 'We cannot go down. If our youngest brother goes with us, then we'll go down, for we can't see his face without him.' Verse 27, then your servant, my father, said to us, 'You know that my wife bore me 2 sons. One left me, and I said, surely he's been torn to pieces, and I've never seen him since. If you take this one from me and harm happens to him, you will bring down my gray hairs and evil to Sheol.'" So Judah steps into Joseph's presence. He shares the story, the backstory of what's happening back home in Hebron. He says, "Look, this son is special. And we weren't even allowed to come back initially because the son is so special to my aging father. And we weren't allowed to come back, but eventually when we ran out of food, we were able to come back. But if this kid doesn't come home, my dad is dead. My dad is as good as dead." Verse 30, "Now therefore, as soon as I come to your servant, my father, and the boy is not with us, then as his life is bound up with the boy's life, as soon as he sees that the boy isn't with us, he will die, and your servants will bring down his gray hairs to Sheol. For your servant, myself, became a pledge of safety for the boy to my father, saying, 'If I do not bring him back to you, then I will bear the blame before my father all my life. Now therefore, please let your servant remain instead of the boy as a servant to my Lord, and let the boy go back with his brothers. For how can I go back to my father if the boy isn't with me? And I fear to see the evil that would find my father.'" Joseph offers his life as a substitute for Benjamin's. He says, "Look, I made a pledge of safe return for this child. Take me instead. Take me instead of him." This is what Joseph was wanting to see. Is Judah truly changed? Is he, as a representative of his 10 older brothers, truly transformed? Absolutely, they were transformed. Joseph begins to lose control of his emotions. He sends the servants away. No one stays around with him while Joseph made himself known. In verse 3 it says this, and Joseph said, this is 45 verse 3, Joseph said to his brothers, I am Joseph. Is my father still alive?" But his brothers could not answer him, for they were dismayed at his presence. Joseph's been playing this game with them for a period of days now, multiple occurrences, and he pulls off the masks. He says, "Look, I'm Joseph. Right? I'm your brother. Is my father truly still alive?" And at this point, the brothers realize that the second most powerful person in the most powerful country in the world has reason to harm them. See, up till now, they had been scared of him because he could harm them. Like just willy-nilly, he could choose to harm them. When they had money in their sacks, they were worried that he would accuse them of theft, right? He had the power to harm them, but he didn't have any motive to do it, right? Like I watch a lot of cop shows, right? You're always looking for motive, right? Why would they do it? What's the motive for this thing, right? What if we don't have motive, we can't convict on the crime. And it's definitely true law, and I know that to be a fact, and no one needs to correct that, okay? But Joseph had no motive. That leader had no motive to dislike these brothers. And so it was kind of a fanciful fear, right? Sometimes we're afraid of things that we don't really need to be afraid of just because we have something in us that makes us skittish. For them, it was guilt that they were harboring ultimately. But now they know this guy does have reason to harm us. We sold him as a slave. We ruined his life. We took him from a position of prominence and security in our family. And we sent him away, faking his death and pretending as if he never was. Our hatred got the better of us. And now he has all the authority to do whatever he wants. And so they are dismayed at his presence. This makes sense. So Joseph, not wanting his brothers to live in that fear any longer, says to them in verse 4, "Come near to me, please." And they came near, and he said, "Look, I'm your brother Joseph, whom you sold into Egypt. And now do not be distressed or angry with yourselves because you sold me here, for God sent me before you to preserve life. For the famine has been in this land for these 2 years, and there are yet 5 years in which there will be neither plowing nor harvest. And God sent me before you to preserve for you a remnant on earth and to keep you alive for you many survivors." Or to keep alive for you many survivors. So it was not you who sent me here, but God. Joseph has a good theological outlook for what took place in his life. Right, and this is the story of Joseph. This is the point of the story of Joseph. It's the thing that as believers we're supposed to hold on to, is that God, even in the negative and the terrible and the bad that happens in our life, right, God is ultimately in charge of using those for his good. Right, and to have the outlook, to be able to look past all of the hurt. Joseph had every reason to be angry with his brothers, to be resentful, to be filled with rage, right? To seek some sort of vengeance on his brothers in an earthly way, like we've all felt that when we've been betrayed, when we've been wronged, we feel like we have the right to go and do. But Joseph understood that there is a God over all of this. And sure, they intended to harm Joseph. But no harm could come to Joseph outside of what God had desired for Joseph to go through. And yeah, it wasn't good to be sold as a slave in Potiphar's house. And no, it wasn't good to spend years in prison for a crime he didn't commit. And he wouldn't wish that on anyone. But that was the path that God had sent him on because God was active in Joseph's story. And God is active still. God is still active in our stories. And I don't know how you feel when things go really bad. I struggle sometimes to see God's big purpose. And I'm sure there were times in Joseph's life where he had no idea what God was doing. Why am I here? I didn't do anything wrong. What is going on? How are all these evil things coming to me? What is the story? Why? But every step down the path that he walked by faith that God had a plan led him closer to understanding what God was doing. And as soon as he sat down at the right hand of Pharaoh to be his right-hand man in charge of food distribution, he began to realize my job is to preserve the lives of people. God sent me into Egypt using wicked hands, using evil hands, but God sent me to do that. Right? God was the one who orchestrated that. God allowed me to go there. God put me there. It's very similar to the story of Christ on the cross, right? You think wicked men, sinful man, Judas, and the Sanhedrin and the wicked people of those days, right? The Jews of that time gathered together, crucify him, give us Barabbas, right? We think, oh my goodness, look how guilty these people are. Look how bad these people are. Look how terrible these people are. But God was moving his story forward through the hands of wicked people. So first thing I want you to know about this story, guys, in your life is that God is still working providentially. Right? We know the end of the story. You can read the end of the story. You can see the return of Christ, the victory of Christ, the union of Christ and his church, the eternity that's going to be spent in the new heaven and new earth. We have the end of the story. And if the end of the story is true, which it is because God ordained it to be true. So if the end of the story is true, that means God is drawing the line of history to that point. And you may be walking in the midst of some absolutely unfair times in your life. You may be dealing with terrible people in terrible situations. You may have bad bosses. You may have bad parents. You may have bad children, right? We've all had that at one time or another. But God is drawing the line of history to its final conclusion, and we are in that path. Sometimes the bad things that overtake us are God putting us where we need to be. And to have trust that there's a God over all these things. And then when we can finally see that, when we have enough perspective to see that God has allowed you to go through what you've been through to get you to where you are now, to stop holding people responsible for the crimes that they committed, right? For the crimes that they committed, the wrongs that they did, right? To forgive generously, knowing that God was using even the wicked deeds of people to get you where you are today. There's been a lot of bad things that have been done to me. There's been a lot of bad things done to you. There are things that I have experienced that I would not want you to experience. Right? I wouldn't wish it on you. I don't want it for you. As friends, as enemies, I wouldn't want it on you. But I wouldn't take it away from me. There's not things that I would take out of my life and I would carve out and say, I'm never going to experience that. Because it helped to shape me into who I am. It's not to say that it was good, because it was wrong, it was wicked, it was evil. But God has used that to shape me into who I am. Joseph was able to see that there was a God who was in charge of all things. And his hand had been working through his whole life. And I want you to know, dear Christian, God loves you. Right? The Bible tells us that God loves his children. And if there's evil and wicked in your life, if there's evil that's surrounding you, like it may be God using wicked people to accomplish his perfect purposes. It's not pleasant to think about the evil coming around us and playing near us. I don't wish bad on you, but we don't grow without rain and without sun. And guys, sometimes we sit in the midst of the rain for a long time, and sometimes the sun is scorching. But God is creating in you new life and growth. God is providentially over things. The other thing that really stands out in the story, by the way, the story goes on from here, just to summarize the end of it for you, is the brothers eventually kind of come to terms that Joseph doesn't currently want to kill them. He says, go and bring your families back here, including my dad. I'd like to see him. We're going to set you up on some prime Egyptian real estate. And so we're going to bring you to Egypt. You're going to be here where the food is nearby and you don't have to go and hunt for it, and we'll take care of everything. And so they go, they convince their father, Jacob, that Joseph is indeed alive, and he says, well, maybe I'll be able to see this son of mine again before I die. Still kind of negative, Jacob, even at the end of his life. And they go back. That's the end of these chapters, just so we can put a bow on what ends in this. But reconciliation is the other theme that I think jumps out in this passage. Right? Joseph arranged a situation to be able to reconcile with his brothers. right? But reconciliation requires two things really to take place. It requires grace to be extended to the one who has done wrong. And I have been extended a lot of grace from a lot of people in my life because I've done a lot of stupid things, right? And we can't reconcile. If I've wronged you, like, and some of you are like, yeah, if I've wronged you, right, the only way for us to come back together, right, I have to come with hat in hand and apologize and own up to what I've done. I have to have some sort of change in heart, right, so that you can trust that maybe I'm not the same person that I was whenever I wronged you a minute ago. But ultimately, you have to be able to extend grace out to me as the person who's been wronged. One of the great powers that we have as Christians is the power to forgive and offer grace to people who do not deserve it. Right? To be quick to forgive. And it is a Christian virtue, right? Blessed are the peacemakers. We're called to be those who are quick to forgive. We're supposed to be slow to become angry. Right, the Holy Spirit allows us to do that. Like just as many of you has been wronged by me, I'm sure there's some of you that have wronged me at different times in our time together over the last decade. And guys, I want to extend a hand of grace because I've been extended that hand of grace more than I can calculate. Christians, we're not supposed to live in animosity to one another. Families aren't supposed to live at war with one another. We're not supposed to be enemies. We're not supposed to be combatants, right? I go to family funerals often, right? And sometimes it's still there. Something happened many, many moons ago. Brothers haven't talked in 40 years. You say, what went on? And the story is when we were 21, something happened. Usually someone borrowed some money or took something, right? And I hate them. If you're the aggrieved party in that situation, you have estrangement in your family, whether it's in your church family or it's in your family, your biological family, your earthly family. To take the first move to extend grace is Christian and right. Right? Inside of ourselves to forgive those who've done wrong and to extend a hand of grace to those who don't deserve it. That's what grace is. And so I'm going to ask you to make that move if you've got those people in your life. You don't want to end up at the cemetery one day looking across the casket from your mama and see that person that you don't want to talk to, but they got to be there because they got to be there for their mama too. If you're holding on to grudges, if you're holding on to animosities, and I'm not saying you weren't wronged. You were. I guarantee it. If you tell me your story and I listen to your story, I'll be like, yep, they treated you wrongly. Terrible people doing terrible things. You were absolutely 100% wronged in that situation. But even then, to extend grace. That's what Joseph does. He says, look, I'm Joseph. And they're like, oh, no. And he's like, come closer to me. Come closer to me. Physically, relationally, come closer to me. I'll tell you, it was a whole lot easier for Joseph because Judah had already shown that he was a changed man, though. And sometimes we're holding out hope, waiting for that person to show that they've changed. And just so you know, like, some people don't. I'm trying to think of a nice way to describe these people. There's not one, so I won't. They're bad people who did a bad thing against you. And they refuse to acknowledge it. They just refuse. What do we do in that situation, Pastor? Well, I think we offer reconciliation, recognizing that we may never fully be reconciled. We do the ministry of reconciliation. We offer grace to the wicked, to the sinner, just as we were offered grace as we were wicked and sinners, in hopes that one day they may come. And if they don't, that's okay, because God is using that opportunity, right, for you to begin to extend grace to change your character and your heart, to shape you more into the image of his Son. Because Christ went to the cross, dying on the cross for the sins of humanity. And there are many who will not receive. There are many who've heard the good news of Jesus Christ, that Christ died for sinners, that God so loved the world, right? And they've heard the message, and for whatever reason, they will not believe. They refuse. Lost in their sin, yet Christ still went to the cross. He still offered grace. Was it grace received? No, but it was grace offered for all. So guys, we need to be those sort of believers who offer grace even to those who may never come back. And God can put some things back together. There may be relationships in your life right now that when you make that first move, they're ready to come home. I don't know all of your stories. I really don't. But I do know in a room this big, there's some broken relationships in a lot of these pews. Between Christian brothers and sisters, between physical, earthly brothers and sisters. It's time to make the move. If you've been wronged, offer the grace. If they don't receive it, allow God to shape your character to be more like Christ, his suffering servant. Let me pray.